The EQB is the smallest and the least expensive Mercedes EV on sale in the United States, and it's the only EV they sell in this market based on an ICE platform. This is related to the GLB, so if I accidentally call the EQB a GLB, my apologies in advance. Now, the GLB is one of my favorite small luxury SUVs right now in the US market, but not all of that favorite status translates to the EQB for a variety of reasons. Let's talk about why you might want the EQB, why you might want to wait for the upcoming EQC, and why you might want to get a Volvo or an Audi instead. As you approach the EQB, logically the first thing you're going to notice is that it looks very much like the GLB. Of course, we get a tweaked front-end design because less cooling is required in an EV and aero is a bit more important. So this entire main section of the grille is just blanked off with this shiny black plastic there. We have that absolutely enormous Mercedes logo that hides the radar sensor, and then another Mercedes logo on top of it on the hood. Of course, we have full LED headlights. This is a combination reflector and projector design. On the inboard side, we find the reflector high beams. We have blue accents here because, it's an EV, so we need that right there. And a big light pipe that runs from one side all the way to the other, connecting the headlights across the front end. I think it's a really attractive and definitely a restrained styling choice up front, but the one thing I don't like is that these grates down here, I should say actually faux grates because they're not really doing anything, those are pretty tricky to clean. On the other hand, the rest of the front end was relatively easy to wipe down. As we move around to the side, you'll notice that the boxy proportions of the GLB are definitely still here. And with it comes the practicality that I've always loved with that particular model. At 184.5 inches long approximately, this is about the same size as a Honda CR-V, and it has relatively similar practicality on the inside, except that you can actually get this with a small third row, which is the main reason we have this larger window back here behind the rear doors. That's so that the rear passengers could actually look out. And unlike many EVs, we have an actual roof rail setup up here. You could put crossbars on there if you wanted to. That obviously lowers your aero performance, but it definitely improves practicality. We also have more of a traditional glass moonroof setup. And if I open up the vehicle, you'll notice that it is a two-pane moonroof, and you can actually see right through those panes, but you can also power an electric shade and close them off. That's not going to have as much of an impact on headroom on the inside because you can see where that headrest is and where that roof line sits right there, but I do like the fact that you can close off that moonroof if you don't want the sun shining on your head. Like the GLB on which this is based, the EQB looks an awful lot more like the GLS than another member of the EQ family, so certainly doesn't look like the EQE or the EQS. We do have some rounded styling going on back here. We have that sort of bell-shaped profile in the rear, but when you really look beyond the sort of rounded edges, you'll notice that we get a very vertical hatch in the back, and that really improves cargo practicality. Obviously, we find full LED taillights back here with red turn signals. That's something that Mercedes has been doing a lot of in their models for the North American market. That's the turn signal blinking right over there. And then again, that big light pipe that connects from one side over to the other. The 250 Plus is the base trim starting just over $52,000 US, although this particular EQB 250 wears an MSRP of approximately $61,500. $52,750 buys you this EQB 250. It's going to give you 188 horsepower, 284 pound-feet of torque, and the only motor is going to be found under the hood. Every EQB is going to be power biased towards the front, but you can get a dual motor if you want one. That would be the EQB 300, giving you 255 horsepower, 288 pound-feet of torque, and making a pretty big difference in the 0 to 60 time. It goes from 8 seconds in this model down to 7 seconds for the EQB 300, and it'll go all the way down to 6 seconds if you get the EQB 350. That gives you even more power on the rear axle, 288 horsepower total, 384 pound-feet of torque, but it's going to cost you at least $60,550. So you do have the option of a basically fully loaded EQB 250 or a base EQB 350 that's going to be 2 full seconds faster 0 to 60. Every EQB is going to use the exact same battery pack. It's a 66.5 kilowatt hour unit sitting sort of skateboard style underneath the vehicle. It doesn't change the interior dimensions quite as much as the XC40 Recharge does, because that battery pack is not quite a true skateboard. That's going to give you 221 to 245 miles of electric range, depending on the version of the EQB you get. They're all going to charge relatively quickly on AC level 2 charging. There's an onboard 11 kilowatt charger standard, but on DC fast charging, thanks to the smaller size of the battery pack and likely some cooling realities, it's going to peak at about 100 kilowatts. Now let's take a look at the interior. The first thing you're going to notice is that, like other Mercedes models, the four-way lumbar support controls are over here on the seat itself, and then the rest of the controls for the driver and front passenger seats are going to be over on the doors. That's also where you're going to find the controls for the seat heating and the seat memory settings. The heated steering wheel button, that's over here on the steering column. Bearing in mind the price tag, this is a four-way manual adjustable steering column. We also have a manually adjustable thigh cushion extension for the front seats. Thanks to the boxy proportions, headroom up front is absolutely fantastic. Right now the seat is pretty high off of its tracks, so if you want to sit in a more upright position, it's still pretty comfy. But if you put it all the way down and have more of a car-like driving position, then you can see I probably have about 3 inches of headroom left there. That's all thanks to the boxy profile. Now let's check out the back seat. When you jump into the back seat, you'll notice things are a little bit different. And that's because the EQB has sort of a stadium seating setup, where the floor actually goes up a little bit for the rear seat passengers versus the front, and the seat bottom cushion here is definitely higher off the ground than it is for the front passenger or the driver. It does give the rear passengers the ability to sort of look around and above what's going on up front, give you a better view of the road, but it also reduces headroom practicality back here. So in this second row seat, I have maybe about an inch, inch and a half of headroom left. You can adjust that a little bit because these rear seats recline. And interesting twist, you can recline the 3 seat sections independently of one another. This does have a 40-20-40 folding seat back. The 40 section right here will flip on its own to improve cargo practicality, but if you flip the driver's side, then it's going to come down with it as well. Rather unfortunately, Mercedes did not send me one of the EQBs with the available third row. It's approximately a $1,250 option. It's certainly one that I would get. Getting back there into the third row is a little bit tricky because of the size of the rear doors. You can see they're not overly large. This is a pretty small vehicle. The second row seats are going to move in a slightly different manner if you do get that optional third row. And it doesn't really impact the cargo capacity too much. Let's take a look back there behind this power hatch. The power hatch is actually relatively tall. That's something that surprised me because this week I have a Mazda CX-90 and I have maybe about 3 inches more clearance with this EQB than I have in that much bigger SUV. As far as the cargo area itself goes, Mercedes says that we have just under 11 cubic feet of storage space available behind the optional third row. That expands to 22 cubic feet if the third row is stowed or if you just have the 2-row option like we have here. I actually think that the Mercedes numbers are wrong because this cargo area feels an awful lot larger. And we were able to squeeze 5 24-inch roller bags back here, so this cargo area is about the same size as the one that we'd find in a Honda CR-V. Pretty logical since this is actually about the size of that CR-V as well. Now if we take a look under this load floor, there's a little latch right there. You can see that we have lots of additional storage space available. No spare tire, but I am surprised that Mercedes has this big thick foam divider down here, because if you were to remove that, you'd have just a little bit more storage space available. This is one of the areas where things change versus the GLB. So the EQB does have a slightly different cargo area under the load floor, but above the load floor, it's actually basically the same. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that this model has about $9,000 of options on it. You can see that we have the power control for that power sunshade right there. It closes not just the front roof section, but also the rear roof section, which is kind of a nice touch. Up front, we have height adjustable shoulder belts and 4-way adjustable headrests for the driver and the front passenger. The general upholstery and front seat design is pretty typical Mercedes. You can see that we don't have terribly aggressive bolstering for the seat back or seat bottom cushion, so larger folks shouldn't have too much trouble there. Again, 4-way adjustable lumbar support and that manual extending thigh cushion for the front seats. Now, if you're a taller person, you should know that the front door is on the small side, again because the GLB is relatively small. And that means that your elbow is probably going to be hitting right around here on the door panel, or sorry, the B-pillar panel right behind the door. That's why we have that little cutout there, rather than on the armrest. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks, so that should give you some idea of what you're looking at there. We have hard plastics at the bottom of the door, just as you'd expect, around that bottle holder, around the speaker grill right there, and then lots of soft touch and stitched materials just above that on the door. Obviously, wood wood trim since we are in a Mercedes, and that wood trim continues over onto the dashboard. But we don't find some of the stitched materials that you might be expecting. The upper portion of the dashboard is just an injection molded component. We do, however, have lots of ambient light piping running around there, just above that wood trim on the passenger side. Even inside those air vents, you can actually see we have that purple illuminated section there. Big trim panel right there running across that side. Decently sized glove compartment. It's a combination shelf and bin style compartment, so you can definitely put an awful lot of stuff inside there. In the dashboard, we find the same twin screen design that we find in other Mercedes with slightly smaller screens, because this is a smaller vehicle, obviously. So this doesn't have those really big, enormous, expansive screens that you'd find in the other EQ products. Also kind of an interesting quirk, you'll notice that Apple CarPlay does not occupy the entire screen here. It's just occupying this little cutout section of that LCD right there. Down below we have an electric start-stop button, 3 big turbine-style air vents. There's maybe a slightly better look at that ambient light strip running inside. It's definitely a really cool touch, something I like in all the other Mercedes models. Toggle controls for the climate control system, so that gets you access over to the menu over there. We toggle the temperature and the various other functions. Those have a really nice feel to them. Down here we have a Qi wireless charging mat for your smartphone and a little lever you can pull out. I'm guessing so that way you could park your smartphone sort of on top of that little shelf. I'm actually not quite clear what that lever is for. If any of you know, let me know down there in the comment section below. Here is the USB interface port for smartphone integration, 12-volt power port over there. These cup holders have adjustable little retractors. We have a touchpad for the infotainment system. You can use this to interact with the system, or you can just touch it. Personally, I prefer to touch it. Over here we have the drive mode buttons. This takes you over to certain vehicle options, 360-degree camera, favorite button. And then we do have the somewhat tricky power and volume roller knob over there. Also not my favorite is the track forward-backward swipe right there on that little button bank. Back here we have a wrist rest and then a button to open this relatively large storage area. I have some random things in there. And inside here you can see it's a pretty deep storage cubby. We have 2 additional USB charge ports and the typical Mercedes key right there. Then moving back over to the driver's side of things, we of course have the full LCD instrument cluster running the same sort of software that we find in other Mercedes models. It's definitely a solid and attractive look and highly configurable. Then moving out from there, we find the same sort of 3-spoke steering wheel we find in a wide variety of other models as well. Paddles on the back. These are regenerative braking paddles. I'll talk about that more in the drive section. They don't operate quite as I assumed they would. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control, along with this sort of BlackBerry-style control nubby. You use that to control that instrument cluster. We have an identical one over here on the right side, and that's used to control the infotainment screen. So you got lots of different ways of controlling things. You can click options like that to turn things on and off, or you can actually just tap over there, or you could use the touchpad in the middle of everything. This is also where we find the volume up-down roller knob, but you'll notice no track forward-backward dedicated buttons on the steering wheel. The wheel itself is leather-wrapped and has some pretty aggressive sport grips. That's a touch I really like. And of course, the shifter is this little column-mounted shifter on a stalk right over there that definitely helps save some room. You can see that we don't have a 360-degree camera, but we do have a backup camera. All right, it's time to get the EQB out on the road. First thing you're gonna notice is, wow, that is massive amount of wheel spin. It continued to spin the wheels all the way to 23 miles an hour if the traction control is not on. Now, admittedly, this road surface is just mildly moist. It rained yesterday, so it's not really overly wet. But these tires, they're not the grippiest available. And that's likely why it took this vehicle 8.1 seconds to go 0 to 60. If I turn on the stability and traction control, come to a pretty dry section of the road, this has been out in the sun all day long, I still get some wheel slip there when you put your foot down. And that's really something you'll notice about the EQB out on the road. 0 to 60 time could probably be better if you put grippier tires on this. Stopping distance is probably the bigger problem for me, at least, though. It took this model in dry conditions before it started raining 140 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is exceptionally long for this segment, actually, and it's something that I was really questioning until I checked out some of the other publications that had recently had an EQB, and they noted similarly long stopping distances. It's all down to the tires, because the traction control and the anti-lock brakes are definitely doing their best to keep the wheels under control regardless of the surface and whether you're accelerating or decelerating, but the tires are definitely a big factor here. This could probably stop in 120 feet or less if it had summer tires on it, but that's not what we have. Keep in mind, this is by far the heaviest version of the GLB. Yes, EQB, GLB, same thing. 4,800 pounds if you choose the dual motor model, 4,500 pounds when equipped right as this model is. Yes, this is about the size of a Honda CR-V, so it's bigger than something like a Volvo XC40, but it's relatively heavy, all things considered, and that's certainly going to take a toll when it comes to acceleration, braking, and handling ability. And I'm going to give the handling score a C+ in this model. I really hadn't expected these tires to, have so little grip, actually, as they end up having. It does make this more fun in a particular sort of way because it's really easy to light the tires up. But when you're going around corners like this, if you get a little bit too crazy on the accelerator pedal, you'll really feel the traction stability control kicking in. And again, there is that relatively long stopping distance. The Volvo XC40 Recharge, especially in the dual motor model, feels a bit better balanced than this Mercedes does. Now, part of that is the way that Volvo has chosen to set up their dual motor system. In the XC40 Recharge at the beginning, they were symmetrical motors, so we had about 400 horsepower front and rear. Now in the new model, it's going to have actually a strong rear power bias because the rear electric motor is bigger than the front. And this is the exact opposite of that. This is always going to have more power going to the front. This is also a bit different than the Audi Q4 e-tron. Even though the Q4 e-tron is certainly more softly sprung than this, it definitely wallows a bit more in the corners. There's more tip and dive if you step on the accelerator or step on the brake, etc. It has 201 horsepower on the rear axle and less power on the front. So you are going to get less torque steer in that model. Although Mercedes has done a fantastic job controlling that. You'd actually feel incredibly little when you floor it, even for something that has nearly 300 pound-feet of torque. Mercedes has done almost magic when it comes to quelling the torque steer. Even around corners like this, Mercedes has done a fantastic job. It's just down to the grip. I personally would be willing to give up 20 or 30 miles of range to put summer tires on this model, but that's something that you're going to have to decide yourself aftermarket. Mercedes doesn't currently offer that kind of package in the US. When it comes to the ride quality, the extra weight that the EQB carries is a bit of a disadvantage. Again, this weighs about 4,500 pounds as we're driving right here, but the suspension has about the same amount of travel as you get in a regular GLB. And the result is that the ride quality comes across as a little firm and bouncy. So oddly enough, a little bit more like a Tesla Model Y than the regular GLB. So if you're looking at something in this size category and you don't really want an extra firm ride, you might want to take a look at the Audi Q4 e-tron. It is certainly more softly sprung than this model. I would actually say that the Volvo XC40 comes across also as a little bit more compliant on rough roads. It also seems to hide some of the larger road imperfections a little bit better than this suspension does. But logically, this is not quite as firm as some of the sport-focused EVs available in the US, and as a result, it's a little bit more livable as well. But when it comes to the ride quality score, I'm still going to have to give this a B-, because honestly, I had expected something just a little bit more comfortable from Mercedes, or at least at this price point, at over $60,000, for this to offer an adaptive suspension system. In our cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 70 decibels in here, making this a little bit quieter than the GLB. Logically, we don't have an engine up front, so there's no engine noise. But we also get a bit more sound isolation thanks to the battery pack being between me and the road. So you get a little bit of extra sound isolation there. This is definitely very GLB feeling as far as its nature goes, though. The steering rack, the way the brake pedal feels, etc. It all feels like the GLB, but it feels like a more refined, more polished GLB because we get the instant acceleration that you'd expect out of an electric vehicle. We also get pretty aggressive regen braking. You can adjust it with these paddles here on the back of the steering wheel, but even in its most aggressive mode, it's not going to take you to a complete stop. It actually is going to keep rolling right there to about 3 miles an hour. I could then put my foot on the brake pedal and engage auto brake hold, but if you're a big fan of aggressive one-pedal driving, this isn't going to have that. On the other hand, it has a near sailing mode, so if I click the plus button, I get D+ there in the instrument cluster, and the regen potential goes down to about, it says 20%, but it feels actually pretty low. It's not quite zero, but it is close. When it comes to efficiency, I definitely give this model an A. I've been averaging 3.7 to 3.8 miles per kilowatt hour, which means that in combined driving, this should beat its EPA estimate. Also worth noting, out on the open highway, I was definitely scoring above the EPA averages in this vehicle. I was actually getting about 3.8, 3.9 miles per kilowatt hour, which did surprise me because of the boxy profile in the rear. This is really only a little bit shorter than a Model Y in terms of overall length, and it's certainly boxier than a Model Y, but efficiency-wise, it's pretty close to that efficiency leader in this segment. This does have a relatively small battery pack, which helps reduce curb weight versus some of the options out there, and that may have something to do with it. But then, of course, there is that particular tire choice, and again, you're going to notice lower efficiency if you were to swap things out for grippier rubber. Now, how does this feel versus the competition? Well, Volvo recently swapped the motors out in the XC40 and the C40 Recharge. In the first version of the XC40 Recharge, it came as dual motor only, about 400 horsepower, and a symmetrical motor setup, so identical motor front, identical motor rear. Now Volvo not only offers a rear-wheel drive version with notably faster 0 to 60 scores than this model, they also offer a dual motor version with a bigger motor in the back, smaller motor up front that has reduced torque steer in the XC40 Recharge, and it also means it has a very different personality than this. It's actually sort of the reverse personality. Volvo's throttle mapping is definitely very aggressive, and Volvo has pulled a lot of things out of the Polestar playbook to really make that XC40 feel more, I guess, EV segment normative, more what a Tesla shopper might be interested in. Then we have the Audi Q4 e-tron, which also starts as a rear-wheel drive vehicle. The suspension is definitely tuned towards the softer side of things versus this EQB. You will certainly notice that. But it has a strong rear power bias and a near-perfect 50-50 weight balance. It also doesn't have the sort of torque steer that you do find just a hair of in the EQB. You'll find about 300 horsepower in the Audi, but again, the reverse power balance to what we find in this model. If I were to pick a model in this European small luxury crossover segment just based on its driving, I would actually pick the Volvo, which is surprising based on where Volvo has been over the last decade, but it really tells you something about how far Volvo has come and what their electric plans are. Now, in an interesting twist, you could also consider the upcoming EX30 a direct competitor to this. That's based on a dedicated EV platform. It is built in China, full disclosure, but it is going to be wicked fast and actually notably less expensive than this. It's going to start around $36,000, which is relatively unusual and unexpected for this segment. You could also, of course, compare a Tesla Model Y, and that is going to probably be the toughest competitor to this. It's going to charge faster, it's going to get you further on its battery pack, and it's also going to be less expensive than this EQB. So let's talk comparisons now. Arguably, Mercedes has positioned the EQB a little bit differently than the electric versions of some of the competitive products. So let's talk about the pricing versus the regular GLB first. The GLB 250 starts at $40,950. That is, of course, for the front-wheel drive model in base trim. The EQB 250, which is not exactly faster than the base GLB 250. All this letter soup is definitely confusing me. It is about $13,000 more expensive, so $53,900. And all the prices we're going to be talking about here include the destination charge. If you want the all-wheel drive version of the EQB, that's $58,050. The 350, which is going to be the fastest version, but still have a relatively small motor in the back, $60,550. And that is the starting point. You can get your EQB up to about $80,000 if you're not careful with the options. And that is definitely very steep when you compare it to the competition. So let's just roll through the competitive chart right here now. First up, the Volvo XC40. In my mind, this is probably the closest competitor because not only is there a gasoline version and an electric version, but because the XC40 Recharge has been relatively popular in this segment as well. The XC40 is an interesting option because it is a solid subcompact luxury entry, so definitely smaller inside than the EQB and the GLB because, again, those are about the same size as a Honda CR-V. It's a little bit more compact versus subcompact, and that's how you get the optional third row in the EQB and the GLB. Of course, it's not quite as boxy, not quite as square, which is also why you don't find as much cargo room behind the second row in the XC40, whether you look at the Recharge model or not. The XC40 is a bit more expensive than the corollary in the Mercedes lineup, depending on the version you're looking at, mainly because all-wheel drive is standard on the gasoline version. So there it starts about $600 more expensive, $41,495. If you want the electric version, that is just a hair less expensive than the Mercedes model, and you still get a two-wheel drive SUV. However, the Volvo actually becomes rear-wheel drive. That was a recent change in the XC40 lineup. Previously, it was available only as a dual-motor model. Then there was a while where you could get a single-motor front-wheel drive model. Now the single motor is actually in the back, and they've given it more range, better efficiency, and faster acceleration. So the base version for $53,645 will give you 293 miles of range. That's about 50 miles more than we find in the Mercedes. 1.5 seconds approximately faster 0 to 60. And it's going to give you a different kind of driving dynamic. Very, very different versus the GLB and the EQB. Something that surprised me in the Volvo lineup is that they've been making incremental changes with the batteries, the motors, the control systems, and the software in the vehicles on a regular basis. Not quite as upfront with some of these changes as we find from Tesla, but arguably, as far as a modern manufacturer that is not Tesla or not a startup, Volvo has been among the most aggressive as far as updating their electric vehicle systems. And I think that really shows in the XC40. The real downside is just going to be its size. Next up, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. That is, of course, the Tesla Model Y. It's going to be a little bit more expensive at $45,630, but it will qualify for the full federal tax credit because it's built in the United States. We don't know what the 2024 tax credit situation will be, so be sure and check back soon on that. But at the moment, it definitely qualifies. And I should mention here that if you lease any of these vehicles, most likely you will still get some form of the tax credit applied to the lease as well. The Model Y does pretty well when it comes to acceleration and range, 6.6 seconds, 0 to 60 for that model, and 260 miles of range. If you want to go further and have all-wheel drive, you'll get that combo in the dual-motor version for $50,630. That is a really impressive price point because when you look at that, the Model Y dual motor is actually less expensive than the single motor EQB. When I say that the Model Y is a bit more expensive, I am of course talking about the GLB 250, which is not an electric vehicle. And that's really the key thing to know about the Mercedes pricing, and really all of these options other than the Model Y. With Tesla, they've really been trying to focus on making their vehicles comparably priced to the gasoline alternatives. Meanwhile, a lot of these car companies have been positioning their electric models as range-topping models and really pushing them higher on the MSRP list. So 330 miles, 4.8 seconds 0 to 60, and a price tag for those dual motors that is less than the base version of the EQB 250. Definitely big deal there. Now let's move back to some of the other luxury options, because I think if you're shopping specifically for a Mercedes EV, you probably want more of a traditional luxury brand. So let's move over to Audi with the Audi Q4. At $50,995, this is a little bit less expensive than the EQB. It's closer to the size of the EQB as well, because it's basically the luxury Volkswagen ID4. Here again, we have a different kind of driving dynamic because the single electric motor is in the back. And that's part of why it's going to get you a little bit quicker 0 to 60, and perhaps why it's going to be slightly better when it comes to range. You'll get about 20 miles more range, although we don't have exact details on some of those efficiency comparisons. We're going to have to skip BMW here because they don't have an EV in this segment, and just move right along to Genesis because they have two interesting EV options. The GV60 is the one we're going to focus more on here because price-wise it gets closer. It starts at $53,195, and it is on a dedicated EV platform. A little bit more like the Audi Q4, but unlike the Q4, it shares very little with its sort of more mainstream counterparts. So it is related to the EV6, the Ioniq 5, and Ioniq 6, but you'd be hard-pressed to tell really inside and outside. It has a very different profile, very different size. It is considerably smaller than the Hyundai or the Kia. It is a solid subcompact vehicle in the luxury segment, and it has kind of a modern twist on whatever Genesis is doing style-wise, both inside and outside. There are areas where I think it's intriguing and some areas where it's a little bit funky, like the weird little orb shifter that pops out of the dashboard. But what's not weird is the performance and the range figures that we get out of this. The base version is the fastest base model in this group, actually. 6.5 seconds 0 to 60, 53,195, and it will give you basically 294 miles of range, almost 300 miles. The GV60 is intriguing on this list in a way, not necessarily because of its range figures or its performance, which are both excellent, but because it is one of the fastest charging EVs available in North America. If you have the appropriate DC fast charge station, you can do 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes, 0 to 100% in under 45 minutes. It is significantly faster charging than any of the other vehicles that we've talked about so far. Yes, including the Model Y. If you're not a fan of the way the GV60 looks, but you like the performance figures in the top-end version, and you love the fast charging, you might want to take a look at the GV70. That model charges just as fast. It's just about as fast as the performance version, but it's actually a little bit less expensive and a little bit larger because it's the next size category up in the Genesis lineup, and it's a bit more conventionally styled. It's not too much bigger on the inside, mind you, but it is certainly more conventionally styled. Now let's move to the Lexus RZ450e. For me at least, this is the least competitive in this segment. It is $60,150 starting, so decent amount more expensive than a lot of these other options. It is ostensibly a little bit bigger than the EQB on the inside, but the difference is not enormous, and there's still no third row in the back. You do, however, get over 300 horsepower and dual motors standard in it, but the range figures are not too fantastic here. In fact, a lot of the numbers really, when you take a look at the RZ, aren't really that great. It charges relatively slowly, the range is not terribly long, performance is not quite where you might expect it to be for that price tag. Keep in mind that you will get 4.4 seconds 0 to 60 in a GV60 for about the same price, and you will go 4.8 seconds 0 to 60 in the Model Y for less. If I were shopping in this segment, I have to admit, if I were looking for the fun factor and the uniqueness factor, I would probably go for the Volvo XC40 Recharge. The dual motor model is a really solid value compared to the EQB. The Model Y is definitely the safe option in this segment. You're going to be able to charge it at supercharger stations. The charging is going to be reliable. It's going to be easy to live with, and it's definitely roomy on the inside. I don't care for the way the Model Y rides exactly. I think it's just a little bit too firm and bouncy. Ride quality is better in pretty much all of these other options, but that is a really solid alternative. Then aside from that, I think I would probably focus on the GV70, to be perfectly honest. I like the more traditional style and the more traditional feel. The interior is really, really well done in the GV70, and it has the same fast DC fast charging we find in the GV60. Performance is ever so slightly lower. Efficiency, oddly enough, is basically the same or slightly better depending on which number you're looking at. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And what do you think about the third row available in the EQB? That really is the party piece in that vehicle. It's the trump card, if you will. If you're looking for a 3-row EV, it is a member of a very limited set, and it's one of the easiest to park, especially if you live in an urban area and you just need an occasional use third row. It's simply going to be one of the better options. The third row back there is pretty small, but I actually think it's a little bit better arranged and better thought out than the third row available in the Tesla Model Y. Let me know what you think about that. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and check out all of our related videos, if I can spit that out, including videos on the GV70 electrified and the Lexus RZ. Those should be coming up very soon. See all of you later.